Hello, and welcome to this interview in our Research Spotlight series, where we talk to researchers who have used eye tracking technology across a broad range of fields. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Bonita Sharif. Dr. Sharif is an associate professor in the School of Computing at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the United States. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Sharif.
Thank you, Marissa. My pleasure.
So I wanted to start by talking about how you got into using eye tracking technology in your research. You have used it for many years. So tell us about your journey.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I actually initially was not in eye tracking. I am in the software engineering field. And as a grad student, I was working in software traceability, actually. My advisor at one point, and I've been publishing in that area, and so I think it's my second year as a grad student. I still didn't have my prospectus. And so my advisor, we had an eye tracker in the library, and he suggested me check it out. And so I went and tried to check out this eye tracker, and he suggested using it to replicate a study that was initially done using a questionnaire. It was trying to figure out how developers, programmers, use camel case identifier style versus underscore identifier style. And we wanted to be able to replicate that using an eye tracker. And as soon as I went to the library, this was a Tobii 1750 eye tracker, quite older one back in the day. But I
Mm-hmm.
went to the library, I checked it out, and it worked great. It had this, I had to reserve the library, of course, it was not my tracker. But as soon as I got to work with it, I was completely hooked because it could tell you, I was intrigued, it could actually tell you what you were looking at while you were reading code. And so that was the start of basically using eye tracking in the software engineering field, because at that point in time there were maybe just one or two papers that used eye tracking as an instrument in software development. And so that got me started. I did that study. We actually were invited to submit got that published. We were invited to submit a larger write up of that study to a journal. So what we decided was we're not going to do this alone because we replicated this. So we contacted the original authors and teamed up actually and made this a family of experiments. So we had 5 experiments that were published on this identifier style, camel case versus underscore, in the Empirical Software Engineering Journal. That was, I think, the highlight of my grad school because it really taught me a lot of things. It taught me how to work with hardware, it's and how to just design studies. A lot of tears also in the process because we had to throw out some data and things like that happen. So, but in the end, I was really happy. I kind of switched to this new method of learning how developers actually read. So yeah, that's how I got started.
That's really great. And I also think it's so interesting to point out that it was an eye tracker that you borrowed. It wasn't something that you had to purchase from the beginning, but being a graduate student and using the resources that were already on your campus is so great, especially for a new technology. And then moving forward to partnering with the original authors of the paper you're replicating to really, broaden both your research network and your research. So I think that's a really great way to get started, especially as a grad student.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that you're in software development and now in eye tracking. So tell us a little bit more about the overarching vision of your research and what are some of the research questions that you're trying to understand or practical challenges that you're trying to understand using eye tracking.
Yes, absolutely. So we have to remember that software engineers are also people, right? So they work with people on a daily basis to communicate requirements, fix bugs. They have teams. Sometimes you're not necessarily in the same room, right? You might have a team further away, let's say in even a different country. So I think software engineering is very much a social field, even though it's not portrayed as one. So what I like to do is I like to study how professional developers as well as students work What separates, for example, an expert from a novice? When does a novice become an expert, right? When is that aha moment that a novice becomes an expert in
Hmm.
whatever their field is? Let's say maybe they're good at front end development or back end development, whatever it may be. I'm also interested in how different stakeholders, developers, testers, business analysts view requirements and software and tests. So the overarching vision is to learn enough about how developers work via their eye movements so we can build better tools to support them in the future. We can use information we learn through eye movements to support development processes by building better tools informed by the eye tracking where they pay attention to, and also support all the different stakeholders because it's not just developers, right? There are testers, there are project managers, there are business analysts, and a lot of stakeholders in the process of developing software.
That's great. So, with looking at these developers, what has eye tracking data allowed you to understand so far about the way humans learn and interact with programming interfaces?
Yes, we learned quite a bit with eye tracking. So one of the things we have implemented in our lab is we have this community infrastructure called iTrace, which is built into the development environment. So for example, if you're a developer and you use Visual Studio or Eclipse, we build this into the development environment where it makes it easy for them to just track their eyes on the specific code tokens that you're looking at. So this lets us map your gaze to the token they're looking at on the fly in the presence of scrolling as well as context switching. This is important because developers don't just work with five lines of code or 20 lines of code that fit on a screen. They work with hundreds of files, correct? They switch between files. They go to the web to look on Stack Overflow to look up maybe a bug they found in the system. And then they come back and switch over. So we built iTrace on the premise that that's how developers work. And we would rather fit their workflow than bring them in a lab and just have them read 5 lines of code. So because of that, we are able to understand what they were looking at while they're reading. So some things that we found is that when we use iTrace to run studies on large open source systems, it doesn't have the same findings as one study that is based solely on static text that's shown on the screen. And we have actually shown this in prior studies where if we gave the entire system to the developer and asked them to summarize a certain method, and they were allowed to look everywhere, they would actually write up much more comprehensive summaries to that method. And they, rather than just looking at the method and looking at the signature and saying, okay, this is what it does, because you're restricted just to that, right? If you're not restricted, you build a much more comprehensive mental model. And so that's one of the things we have actually seen is if you do run studies in a large open context supported by our community infrastructure, iTrace, we get different results.
And iTrace is an open source tool that is available for people to use, correct?
Correct.
And
Yes,
compatible.
iTrace
Yeah.
is open source. It has a client server architecture, so there's a core that connects with the trackers. We just released actually a module for visualization and screen recording. So now you can actually also screen record and then play back your fixations on the screen.
Great. And it's compatible with Tobii eye trackers.
Yes, we
Are there
support.
certain models that they work with, or they work with all of them?
We support Tobii trackers. We support all the research grade trackers. So all of them.
Okay.
I have the Fusion and I have the Spectrum. They both work really well. I also have the TX300. And so all of them, yeah, I use this actively in studies we're doing right now.
Great. I know that you're also really heavily involved in the ETRA conferences, which is a symposium on eye tracking research and applications. So, from your current perspective of understanding the technology of eye tracking, what advice would you share with other researchers who are considering adopting eye tracking in their own work?
Yes, so ETRA is a very diverse conference. I serve as the steering committee chair, and I feel I love this conference because I learn a lot every time I attend it. There's social scientists, there are psychologists, there are computer scientists, people that are just learning how students, for example, read math problems or read chemistry equations. And so that's just the beginning. There's a lot of neural based models now that use eye tracking as input to learn how developers, especially in source code, how they actually um, do a task or summarize a method, for instance, or fix a bug. So if somebody wants to get into this field, I would say we welcome you. We would love for more people to enter the field. This is why we made iTrace open source, because we want other people to use it and try it out. But one thing is, one suggestion I would give is definitely reach out to somebody that you know is already doing eye tracking, because that'll help you just get onboarded quickly. And I'm always happy to, I get emails like this all the time, and I'm happy to provide resources to people on where they can get started or a paper they can read. But there's so much work to do in the field, even in just my field of software engineering and eye movements, that I can't do it all. I have a list of at least 10 studies, actually more than that, that keep growing, and I have only 3 students that can do only so much. And so, I'm happy to always open to collaborations if it makes sense, obviously.
That's great. There's a lot of space still available for using eye tracking technology as a tool, not only in software development, but in all sorts of fields. And the more the merrier. So, and especially going back to how you got started borrowing an eye tracker, I think there are lots of people like you who exist who already have systems that want to be able to share the eye tracking tools as a resource, get other students or get their faculty involved in using it and whatever their research questions might be, and keep building this community of eye tracking researchers to make the analysis and the tools that exist even better.
Yes, exactly. If you look at the papers that are published since, there was one paper in 1990 that was published on code by Martha Crosby from the University of Hawaii, and then nothing until 2006 or 2007. And I started publishing in
Wow.
2009. But if you look at the trajectory, it is increasing. People are getting into the field. So I always look at that graph, and I want to see more people in there, because it's kind of lonely if you just do this by yourself. You want other people to replicate with different settings, try different tasks even. For example, there are so many other tasks we can look at, even in software. For example, how do people review code? How do students learn to review, for example, in their software engineering program?
Right. And you can look at expert versus novices to try to understand the way that they use their eye movements to learn or to process some of this information and see even changes over time.
Absolutely. I mentioned something before about when is that aha moment that the novice becomes an expert. In order to
Right.
learn that process, you really need to follow each person in their undergraduate degree. It's almost like the person is their own control, and you follow them through their 4 years. And when is it during those 4 years, or which course makes them really truly understand certain concepts?
That's great. So you mentioned that you have a series of questions that you haven't been able to get to yet, but they're next for you. So are you able to share some of the research questions that might be next either for you, or if you're working with other people, where do you want to see your research go?
So currently, I'm running a study on emotional awareness and software development. This is the most complex study I've run to date, because it involves not just eye tracking, but it also involves a GSR device and facial expressions. So we are taking 3 inputs and basically syncing them together. We just ran our 21st participant. Yay, we're hoping to get 30.
Wow.
Um, but it's a 2 hour study, and so it's kind of complex and it has a lot of moving parts. But we um, tried this. We did a pilot for a year before making this finalized and get real subjects come in or participants come in. But here we are kind of hoping to see if, and this is not published yet, like I said, but I can give you a slight preview as to we are trying to avoid software developers are they burn out really quickly. They work a lot, right?
Mhm.
Can we regulate emotion in software to determine, for example, if you're tired, the system can say, okay, you might need a break right now. Okay, or if you're rereading something over and over and you're not just not making progress, maybe a break would be better than you trying to just sit there and hit your head on the wall and trying to figure it out right when you're stressed. So I think we are trying to learn from this study, what is that point, what is the patterns of the eye movements for, in particular our context is bug fixing. And so, yeah, we're excited to learn what the facial expression shows, what the GSR shows for the spikes in stress, and then also the eye tracking, obviously, is very important.
So, do you find that if people have more fatigue or are more tired, maybe they miss some of the bugs, and or what are the things that you find so far with their bug fixing?
So, with bug fixing, not in this particular study, we haven't analyzed it yet, but in a prior study where we did a study where we looked at bug fixes, what we found is that the more experience they had, the quicker they could fix the bugs, and they looked at the correct place faster than the novices. I mean, most of the time, the novices fixed them as well, but it took longer for them to actually even get to that point of where the bug was. Um, there were unnecessarily moving through irrelevant parts of the code when the experts did not do that as much as the novices did. But we are excited to see how emotion plays a role in this new study.
Yeah, that would be really cool. I don't think I've heard of researchers using those tools with software development and eye tracking yet. So it sounds like you're really on the cutting edge of that for your research questions.
There are some colleagues that are doing this, Nicole and Alexander from Italy, and yeah, we do reference their work in our related work section.
Great. So, what are some of the most exciting applications that you see for eye tracking in the future, either in the research space or in the real world?
So, the killer application, we'd all be rich if we knew the answer to that. But what I think, from my perspective at least, I'm working currently on supporting eye tracking in the presence of editing within the integrated development environment. So let's say you're a developer, we don't just read, right? In order to fix the bug, we have to then actually type code and fix the bug in the system. Now, as you know, with eye tracking, as soon as you change the lines and you press enter and you change something in the code, the coordinates change. And so the eye gaze needs to be mapped accurately to that change. That's something that's not a trivial problem, super hard to get right, many corner cases. So we are trying to deal with building an edit model that supports that um, through the editing of code. So that's my first challenge that we're trying to address as the iTrace team. Once we have that, then we can actually ask questions about, how much does someone edit? How does the edit patterns match their eye patterns? Do they look ahead? Do they revisit calls to what they've written? For example, if they're trying to call a function, do they actually call it first versus going and writing the function? So it's all about how they go about actually fixing the bug if they have to write new code. So there are lots of patterns that we don't know yet because nobody has ever done that because we didn't have the tools in place to support that, right? For good reason, obviously, because the coordinates change. And so we're trying to come up with this model that accurately detects this. And we have some ideas in mind, but we have to actually sit and implement that. And once we do that, then we can look at those patterns that I talked about before. That's the research side. I think in general, in real life, team sports comes to mind. How people
Hmm.
actually play in a team and using eye tracking to, that's always a side thing I always wanted to do, is look and see how people communicate non-verbally with their eyes in team sports. Gaming is another one. What differentiates
Hmm.
expert gamers from novices? Do they look at certain parts of the screen? I've seen these expert gamers stream their eye movements on Twitch. It's pretty fascinating to look at. It's a nice educational tool as well, right, to teach novices.
Right. Yeah, I think actually some of those streamers have used Tobii gaming eye trackers to stream live while they're playing. It's really fascinating to see through the eyes of someone who's an expert at that particular uh, type of skill, and see where they're looking and what areas of the screen do they utilize.
Yes, and then taking that concept to coding, think about having an expert developer um, debug live and show that their eye movements to a novice to see this is how I would go about reading this versus a novice who would learn that eventually, but maybe they can learn it faster if they looked at these eye movements.
Absolutely. That's a really interesting application of expert versus novice or sort of professional development training. We see that in other fields like healthcare,
Yes.
fields of watching an expert surgeon go through a particular procedure, but even something like debugging code, you can absolutely watch and mimic someone who's an expert at it if you're a novice and learn from that. That's a very cool application.
Oh, I agree.
Great. Well, is there anything else that you would like to add um, as we're wrapping up our interview here today?
I just want to say if you want to get started in eye tracking, definitely contact one of the people that have published at ETRA. Just email them and talk about their work. They'd be happy to respond to that. We love hearing about our work because we spend so much time on it. Um, but also, if you are already, you have an eye tracker, make sure you do those pilots because there are so many things that you uncover before you actually run your data collection. Make sure you run through the entire pipeline. When I say pilot, I don't just mean collect the data in your mind by saying what you're going to do. You literally have to go to the lab, sit in front of the eye tracker with a participant that will not be in your main study, go through the entire workflow, your protocol, but don't just stop there. Also take that and then run that through your analyses as well, because you have to have all of that done before your first participant comes in, right? What are the metrics you're going to use? What are you going to run? Because oftentimes what we have found is sometimes the metric we want to run, we didn't think for to collect. So that those are the things that those disconnects are easily found if you run through the entire pipeline, the data collection, the analysis, and then the final spreadsheet you're going to run your stats on.
That's great. That's a great reminder to think about the end goal and not just use eye tracking as an exploratory tool, but there are all sorts of metrics that you can have access to understand visual human attention, especially with Tobii systems, and explore all of those as you're getting your design process started to make sure that you're getting the data that you actually want at the end.
Yes, and I also want to say one more thing because I get approached a lot by people wanting to do eye tracking. The first thing I ask them is why. Why do you want to do eye tracking? Because not every experiment needs it, right? There are some experiments we do that don't need eye tracking simply because it doesn't need it. So just because you have an eye tracker doesn't mean you have to use it for everything.
That's great too. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bonita. It was really a pleasure speaking with you today. I hope this conversation has been fun for you to reflect and share on your research journey and inspirational to our audience of people who are listening. So we look forward to reading your future publications, and thanks so much again.
Thank you, Marissa. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.